Good afternoon. I'm Judith Chubb, a professor of political science and director of the Peace and Conflict Studies concentration at Holy Cross. On behalf of Peace and Conflict Studies and the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, we're especially delighted today to welcome Dr. Lisa Dodson, who will speak on American poverty and the rise of a moral underground. I want to share with you just a little bit of Dr. Dodson's both sort of personal, professional, educational background, because I think it's particularly fascinating and can give you the students some insight into the sometimes unexpected routes by which people end up where they are. Professor Dodson attended college at Boston University, and while she was in college, she also worked the night shift and became a shop steward for the Bakery and Confectionery Union of the AFL-CIO. So began already as a college student with a background as a union activist. When she graduated from college, she went to Mass General Hospital and became an OB/GYN nurse and worked in community health centers in some of the poor neighborhoods of Boston. And working as an OB/GYN nurse, she became interested in public health as opposed to nursing in and of itself. So she went back to Boston University School of Public Health and got a master's degree in public health, and then worked as the director of women's and maternal health for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In the course of doing that, she came to the realization that the most important problem in public health in the United States is poverty, and decided that she wanted to go back and get an academic degree which would allow her to do deeper research on the impact of poverty on low-wage workers in the United States. So she went back to the Heller School at Brandeis University and got a PhD in sociology and public policy. And since then has published 2 books. The first, published in 1999, is called Don't Call Us Out of Name, The Untold Lives of Women and Girls in Poor America, in which she integrated 8 years of field research to uncover an alternative account of welfare reform, this time told from the perspective of hundreds of single mothers and their children. And then she went on to do another 8 years of field research, culminating in a second book published in 2010, the one she's going to speak more directly about this afternoon, called The Moral Underground: How Ordinary People Subvert an Unfair Economy. And since has published other articles and reports based on the problems of low-wage working poor in the United States. In addition to her academic publications, she's presented her research findings in U.S. congressional hearings to the United States Equal Opportunity, Employment Opportunity Commission, as well as to not just academic settings, but has spoken extensively to labor unions and community organizations about her work. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Dodson.
First, I just want to really thank you all for inviting me here. I particularly want to thank Dr. Chubb, Judith Chubb, for her introduction, and also just all of you for taking the time and coming out. I know that you're busy. I know you have other things to do, so I'm really delighted to be here and appreciate the invitation. I've organized my talk to make sure that there will be time at the end for your questions or comments that you might have, because my interest in raising the issues that I'm going to share with you is really to hear your thinking about them. I'm hoping I'll provoke you, and I really always include the ideas I hear from people, particularly now work with college students that I'm doing. So I'm very interested to hear from you. I hope you'll speak up. So today what I want to do is I want to share with you my thinking about what I call a moral underground, which it's my belief is growing in this country. It is pretty quiet, it is modest in many ways, but I believe that it is growing in this country. And I think that it could signal a turn away from our nation's escalating inequality and turn more towards a commitment to fairness, which I actually believe is very much a part of who we are as a nation, who are people. I think it's very much a part of the American people. But to get to that kind of lofty idea, what I wanted to do was start out by telling you a story. It's really a story about some students who are, I would guess, somewhat like you in where they are. And I haven't actually told this story in a public gathering like this yet, so I am curious to hear how you're going to react to it eventually. So last year I was giving a talk on these same issues, on the idea, I was giving a talk about inequality and particularly low-wage work, which is what most of my research now is specifically about low-wage work. And so I was giving a talk, and after the talk, a student came up and said she wanted to speak to me privately. And so we went aside, and I'll call her Kim. And she is a student. So this is a university on the East Coast, and so Kim wanted to speak to me privately, and she told me that the week before I was at her university, she'd come across some paperwork, and the paperwork was really in as part of her work in student services. She's a work-study student there. And she'd come across some paperwork that made it evident that another student, we'll call him Edward, was going to be asked to leave the college. He was going to be asked to leave. And he was going to be asked to leave. He was in his third year because he couldn't pay tuition. He was going to be unable to meet tuition that year, which in this university I'm talking about, it's tens of thousands of dollars a year. He was in very good academic standing. He had not engaged in anything that had breached the rules of the university, but he had not, it was an economic matter. It was a fiscal matter. It was not a personal one. For Kim, it had actually become a deep moral dilemma. So that's what she wanted to talk to me about. She said that she happened to know this student well, and that she knew that he came from a lower middle class family, and that they had managed to save enough and borrow a lot more than that in order for him to go to college. And she knew that both his parents worked, which is not uncommon. They worked, and that actually Edward had been on his way to become a physical therapist. He was something of an athlete. That's what he decided to do. And he had figured out that within 5 years of graduating, he should be making somewhere in the neighborhood of $80,000 to $90,000 a year. He'd be able to pay back his loans. They wouldn't be on his family. But when he entered his third year of college, the landscaping company where his father had been working for more than 15 years had been sold. And all the crews, which were altogether about 45 people, had been terminated. And the new owners were going to rehire, but they were going to rehire at much lower wages. They were going to rehire more as like a contingent workforce. So a workforce you bring in when you need it, and when you don't need it, you don't have to pay for it. And he said what he had told her was that the crews had been, of these 45, they were all men. What they'd been told was that this wasn't a personal issue. It was a business decision. It was really a fiscal decision. As we're taught to believe, business decisions like that are not moral matters. So here's what else Kim knew about Edward. She knew that he'd worked every weekend, and he'd worked summers, and he'd worked during the breaks. She also knew his mom worked as an elder care worker at night, and she knew that these people were deeply dedicated to Edward's success. They'd staked everything. Really, the family had staked everything on that. And that he had been trying to negotiate as much as he could in order to find a way to stay at the university. He'd offered to work in as a resident advisor. You know, I'm sure everyone here, or many of you perhaps, have done work in food services. And Kim believed that this was going to actually crush him and maybe his family as well. Now, for me, this is actually less of a story about Edward, because there are many, many Edwards. There are many young people in college who run into this wall, and there are also a lot of people not in college, people who are holding on to jobs or maybe have gotten new jobs, started families, and they lose them, or they find that they cannot make ends meet. There are older people who are moving towards retirement, who are trying to get their kids through college and maybe help their elderly parents, and are having the economic rug pulled out from under them. Because these are business decisions that will reduce costs or increase gains without the responsibility for the human collateral, the damage that it caused. For me, this is really more a story about Kim, because she was an insider who'd been watching how rules that are treated as objective processes, as neutral lines, how they might take down a whole family, that she happened to know pretty well. And so she told me that she was struggling with her moral position, because what she said was she in fact could make some of this go away for him. There was some sleight of hand she could engage in working where she did in student services. She knew how communications happened in that office. She knew the files. I actually didn't ask her details. I tend not to ask for details when people are telling me these accounts. What I was paying attention to was Kim, who was in many ways a very ordinary young woman, as we all are, ordinary person, who was taking on a kind of, I thought, extraordinary moral dilemma in her thinking. Yeah. And she's not alone. And that's what I know now from the work that I've done. She's not alone, and that's really what the research for this book taught me. So I'm going to step back now and just talk a little bit very quickly. I have some slides I want to go through with you that are they're slides that really lay out the conditions that give rise to a moral underground. So what I wanted you to look at with this more than anything else, so it's two things I wanted you to look at. One is how much, so this is 1967 all the way to 2011. And anyone, if you have any questions about the slides, I can tell you where they come from. Some of them actually show you, but not all of them. Unfortunately, they got cut off. But clearly what I want you to see is how flat the social mobility is for, three of the quintiles, of the population, and obviously that there's a big difference for the top 5%. And this is another, this is pie chart distribution, really talking about the same kind of, laying out the same kind of data. What I'm most concerned with, and I've actually seen many different of these, and they're always slightly different. People use slightly different figures. But what I wanted you to see was just what a large percent of, both in terms of net worth, so personal net worth pooled, and then financial wealth, which is investments, that 80% of the population in terms of net, it's around 11%. I've seen as high as 15%. And then when it comes to financial wealth, it's such a small percent, such a large percent of the population that has such a small percentage of the wealth. And then obviously the top 1 or top 5% has such a large share of it. And in terms of my work, what I'm most interested in is working families, and in fact, working families are the majority of the poor and the near poor now. People who are employed, people who are engaged. That's different from another time. It's the way it is now. Following the recession, in fact, about 10 million more people fell into that poor or near poor category. And as you probably know, children in the U.S. are the most likely to be poor or near poor. And so just quickly, some of you may know these data very well, but not everybody does. What does it mean, poor or near poor? So the poverty line right now for a family of 3, this is rough cut here, but for a family of 3 is $19,500 a year. So when we talk about poverty, that's the poverty line. And of course, what that means is if you're even $1 over what is considered the poverty line, you're not counted as poor. So what many of us do when we want to look at the magnitude of poverty and people who are struggling with it is we use 200% of poverty. And you can do this math pretty easily. Family at 200% of poverty, $39,000 for a family of four, family of three, 45 for a family. I threw in the minimum wage here because I wanted you to take a look at that. That's the current debate that's going on about working poor in America. And it was a very quiet debate. It's now becoming quite an important debate. So I wanted to throw that figure in too. So anyway, the annual income at minimum wage is $15,000. I also, I don't know about your college, but this is the college where I am, Boston College. So the tuition and room and board for one student for 1 year is over $60,000 at Boston College now. And that's 25% more than what we look at for a family of four at 200% of poverty. I think that the tremendous disparity is what emerges from this. And I threw that one other figure in there. The average cost of infant care is $17,000 a year in Massachusetts. That's $2,000 more than the full-time income of what I pay a lot of attention to, and we actually gather the best data in terms of poverty in America, is on children. So just sort of quickly looking at that, right at 2009, after the recession had really begun to see some impact in terms of these figures, 42% of all children under the age of 18 fell into that poverty, poor or near poor, what I just showed you, what those figures are. And then 1 year later, it had gone up to 44%. That's about 1.5 million more children in that year had fallen into that category. And in particular, it's young children who are most affected, who tend to have the highest level of poverty. Right now, half of children under the age of 6 fall into those wage or those income that I showed you, poor and near poor. That's half of our children are growing up in America today, and that's what their experiences are. I also wanted to make sure that you knew that a lot of people know this in this country. There's often, I think, a kind of discourse out there that Americans aren't aware of this, that in fact, or don't care, that this is not an issue people care about. But the Pew Foundation, there's a number of different surveys like this, but the Pew did this one, Pew Research Center, and the results of this, well, you can read it yourself. Close to 2/3 of people, in fact, think that the system is not a fair system and that the wealth are favored. So the other thing I wanted to bring up, because it's very relevant to the research I do and the kind of information I collect, is not just wages, but also what low-wage jobs are like. And these are just two elements I wanted to pull out, and one is that for paid leave, so sick leave or maternity leave, that 81%, so the higher people who make more wages, people who are in the higher categories of wages, are much more likely to have paid leave. And that's the same with work flexibility. And the point of this is that if you're a poor person and you don't have a lot of wages, you also, and working family, you're also very likely to be working a job that has the least amount of flexibility and gives you the least time off. And really my statement at the bottom here is, parents cannot stay home because they can't afford to stay home, but they also can't afford to purchase childcare. And in the U.S., that's not a universal right to have access to safe childcare for children. So what I'm going to tell you more about now is what I did and what I found. And just very briefly, I wanted you to see some of the places where I went, the social settings that I went to in order to talk to people. And I talked to people not only who were low income, but I talked to all these people. I wanted to know what they see too. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And I'm just going to leave this up as I go on with my talk, and hopefully I'll have time to tell you a little about what's going on there. So this is the kind of background. This was the terrain that I was in, that I moved around in when I began to do the kind of work that I do, which is talking directly to people, asking people about their lives. I don't actually do statistical analyses. I'm really glad other people do them and do them really well. Because I love to use their work. But what I do is I like to go out and actually ask people about their lives. And so now I'm actually going to introduce you to another person who was someone I talk about in my book, but I'm going to go into more detail about her right now. A really face-to-face with a woman named Emily, who I met the first time about 9 years ago, and I had a chance to meet with her a number of times, which is really helpful for the kind of work that I do. Now, Emily wanted, when we were talking about what about her story I was going to use for my book and present, because I tell people this is what I'm going to do with the information you give me, and what she wanted me to focus on more than anything else was how she handles after-school care. That's the piece of her life that she felt was sort of most critical and she thought most revealing. So Emily, at the time I met her, had 2 children, and though she was a single mother, her children's father was actually quite involved with them and provided some support. And at the time that I first met Emily, her daughter Flora was about 9 years old and her son Teddy was about 5 years old. She said that they attended the same school, which is a real, that makes life a lot easier. So they were in the same grammar school. Her problem was simple, that the children's school ends at 2:30 in the afternoon and she doesn't get out of work until 4 or 5 or sometimes 7, depending on that week and what the store's needs are. So here's her week. Here's what they do. On Monday after school, a neighbor meets the 2 children and walks them to a youth center that's about a couple of blocks away. This is a Midwestern city, a couple of blocks away, where from the school there's a center that offers free child care, but just 1 day a week on Mondays. So this neighbor, who also has a child in that program, offered to, just out of kindness, offered to walk Teddy and Flora with her. There's a gap in time between when Emily gets home and when this neighbor drops them off then on her way home, but Flora has a key. Of course, if this neighbor's child is sick or something comes up, she's not there. There's no contract here. It's just, and then the children have to go by themselves. On Tuesday, Emily's sister takes an early day from work. First, she picks up her own baby from a sitter's house, and then she takes a bus, and she picks up Flora and Teddy, and then she takes the 3 children to her apartment. And Emily told me they generally sit around and watch television. Emily's sister's paycheck is very small. It doesn't cover enough for an extra meal for the children. Emily gets home, picks them up around 7:30. They get home around 8. She gets dinner around 8:30 or 9 on that night, on Tuesday. On Wednesday, the children walk 2 blocks to a bus stop, the public bus, and they take the bus to their paternal grandmother's, their father's mother's house. As often as she can, a teacher at the school, who I actually had the opportunity to interview as well, a teacher, a 2nd grade teacher, will walk the children to and wait with them at the bus stop for when the public bus comes. The children's grandmother has diabetes and she has problems with her feet, so she can't meet them. So the children then get off the bus and walk to her apartment. Flora actually had 2 keys that she had around on a chain because she had to get in her grandmother's apartment as well. Their father doesn't get off work till about 9. If he can get any overtime, he always takes it, and so he gets home late. And one of the things Emily said is that the kids don't want to go to sleep. They want to see their father. I mean, that's, and he wants to see them. So they are, she said, usually dead tired the next day. On Thursday, there's nobody watch the kids. She hasn't ever been able to find an arrangement. So what they do is when school ends at 2:30, Emily and Flora have devised ways for them to try to stay inside the building, the school building, for as long as they can. They sit in front of the office pretending that perhaps they have something they need to do there, or what they usually do is they go to the gym. That's the last building, that's the last room in the building that's locked down at this school. The school doesn't have after-school staff. The staff leave when the day is done. They expect children to be picked up. So the children usually end up on the playground playing or hanging out, rain or shine, till about 4 p.m. And then on Friday, Emily has an early day, and she's able to get to school when the kids get out. Now, there's a lot more to the story than I actually put in the book. One of the things that they talked to me about, Flora did as well was what she tries to do if Teddy has to use the bathroom. He's 5, he can't wait necessarily. What she's supposed to do with him when they're out on the playground and he needs the bathroom, or what happens when a group of bigger kids come to the playground to use it, which kids will do. And they can be intimidating, and what Flora is supposed to do if a man approaches her and tells them that he wants to take the 2 kids out for a meal, which has happened. I also didn't add, which for me in many ways was the most moving part of the story, was that Flora dreads the end of the day. She's 9 years old, she dreads the end of the school day, and she tries to keep her teacher in conversation to put off this time, to put off the time of day when she has to become an adult that she's not ready to be, to watch over her brother and herself. I actually often tell this particular story. I have many, but I tell the story of Flora and Teddy precisely because there was no terrible incident, or not that I recorded, I was aware of over the years I knew them. There was no terrible incident that happened remarkably, and that's why they've never made it in the newspaper. They've never come to public attention or any authority. They are very small stories. These people's stories are very small, and in fact, they try to keep a really low profile because Emily knows what all low-wage mothers know, and that is if her children's plight did come to the attention of the authorities, if there was a media, some event that happened, then what Child Protective Services got involved. Well, what would happen if that happened? If Child Protective Services became aware of these children? Yeah. They're not going to knock on Emily's door and say to her, you're doing everything you can. You should have child care. Let's figure out a way to subsidize child care. That's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is she's going to be blamed, and she is going to be, and she will be in trouble. So they keep the stories underground. A lot of these stories are kept underground. It's part of the moral underground from my perspective. And like Edward, who I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, Emily is one of millions. She's one of millions of people who face these kind of untenable choices, working hard and unable to make sure her children are safe. So I had gathered many of these stories, many of these accounts, and along the way I began to turn to, as I showed you in a previous slide, to this list of middle income and higher income people who teach and supervise or are managers in stores, or who heal, who are healthcare. And the question that I have learned to ask is this. I ask them, what do you see when you face working moms like Emily, or when you're educating a child like Flora? So what do you see? And, I want to reflect back on that graph I showed you, because actually a lot of people do see that it is unfair. They do see that. And I found that people, exactly that people recognize unfairness. But I got more than that, and that's what I want to tell you about too. I met teachers who told me that they just don't know what their jobs are anymore, because kids come to school exhausted and sometimes hungry without their homework done. Children who may be like Teddy and Flora, who may have different after-school arrangements. Kids get anxious. They're not prepared. And we want our kids to go to school ready. That's a term. That's what we want. They're not prepared. And some teachers said to me that the old knee-jerk way of looking at that, because it's bad parenting, dysfunctional families, that it is the mother's fault, the father's fault, sometimes that just doesn't seem to hold up, because they would ask, is Emily really a bad mother? Is their father a bad father? And I've heard nurse practitioners and doctors say that they're not sure what their jobs are anymore. As one said, when I have to send this dad home because his health insurance doesn't cover the treatment he actually needs, and I can guarantee you he's going to come back next week sicker, and he could lose his job at the construction company, and that's the job that's keeping his family intact. So what do? Do I lie and say he has another condition, a condition that will be treated? And I heard a manager say, do I dock this mom's pay? Do I dock her pay because she's got to go home again? She's got to go home again for a sick child. and we give them 2 days a year, but her 2 days of sick leave are long gone. The rules are the rules. I heard this phrase, 3 strikes and you're out, a number of times. But one manager actually said to me, so the rule is I fire her, so what do I say to myself, that I'm just following orders? And then I found that even beyond those who were raising these questions, I found that the impact of this level of inequality was spreading, and that it was affecting much more of society than the people who themselves are living poor. I found that some ordinary people were actually asking themselves, do they have responsibility beyond the rules? And this was really, for me, the unexpected piece, because I found people, though they were not themselves living poor and would not, very unlikely they ever would, they believed that they should actually disobey some of these rules. That's what they believed. I met several grocery store bosses who thought that to send a dad home at the end of the day of sorting and stacking food with a paycheck that did not make it possible for him to bring food to his table, enough food to pay to feed his children, that was wrong. And maybe it was a bigger wrong than siphoning off some food and putting it in bags and making sure that he took those bags home with him. And I met doctors who thought that only treating the child in the family because the health insurance was for children alone, when you see the mom has strep too, that they thought maybe it was a worse wrong to send her home sick. And writing up another script, claiming there's another child in the family, that was actually a lesser wrong in this situation. And I also met restaurant managers who were breaking rules and letting workers construct their own work schedules, which was this is a chain of stores, absolutely against the rules. They let them create their own schedules, and then they signed off on papers, what you would call falsifying documents. They signed off on papers because otherwise these workers would have children that would be dropped off their buses, and this is an urban setting, and there'd be nobody there to pick them up. And I spoke to a principal of a very large urban school, and she had specialized in making sure that special needs for children included children who just needed some one-on-one help, not because they were hyperactive, but because they had become hypervigilant in a world in which their parents simply can't buy the basic ingredients to keep them safe. That's not how that program is supposed to be used, but that's how she's using it. She would call it cheat. That's what that would be the term. She would be cheating on this program. Up in northern Maine, I met a couple of truck drivers whose oil trucks make some unscheduled stops at the houses of elderly people who had $200 fuel vouchers, but they'd run out in December, and it was February, and these guys said to me that they thought that the fuel company was going to do okay, that the petroleum company was going to be just fine, but that these people they thought would not be. And so they make some unscheduled stops, and they got to do something with the gauge. I don't know what. I never asked details of these. And this is a list that goes on because the level of inequality has gotten deeper and has spread, and it touches all of us. And so I began to meet people who rejected the idea that they don't have any responsibility. I want to say I also met a lot of people who rejected the idea that they do have any responsibility. I met plenty of people who said that the rules are the rules and it's not my business of what's happening to those people. I met those as well. But I met people who, frankly, to my surprise, said that because they had that insider's knowledge, like Kim, who works in student services, they had this insider's knowledge, they decided to give information and divert supplies and sometimes even access to money because they believe that the problem isn't that individuals aren't taking responsibility, that they're dysfunctional. They believe that the problem is that everything is stacked against them. All those people who are working hard and are not earning enough to get by, and the problem really is an unfair economic structure. I heard people talk about breaking rules, and they talked about breaking rules as something that is wrong, but they also thought that there are bigger wrongs. So over the years of listening to these stories, and as Judy pointed out, I tend to do my research for years before I come out with a product. over the years of listening to these stories, I heard what I see as an echo of our best American history. It's a history in which people, it's a history, for example, in which people who would never have known slavery, would never have known it, their children would never have known it, but in time they joined an underground. They joined an American underground. They took part not only in refusing to participate in the institution of slavery, but they actually took part in acting against it, and they did so at some risk. To be actors in abolishing something that you think is wrong. They came to the conclusion that even though it had been successfully argued, and this was the argument, right, the central argument of slavery, it was a central argument of child labor, that it is a business case, it is a business argument, that there is enormous economic interests at stake. But in fact, a lot of people came to the conclusion that it was above all a profound human rights issue. It went to the moral core of our society, so they broke rules and the laws, and in time, in certainly the first case I gave you, in terms of slavery, they created a movement that changed our country. Now, we know those people now as our heroes. They are greatest heroes, abolitionists, people who led the fight against child labor, which also took hundreds of years. People who did that, we know them now as heroes, but at the time they started, there were very few of them. They weren't necessarily in touch with each other, and they were known as outlaws, that they were known as breaking the laws. And so that's how I've started to see some of these small acts that are in support of small people, unknown people like Flora and Teddy and also maybe Edward. I began to see them as acts of civil disobedience or economic disobedience. And I see them in that old light, kind of moral stands that we do sometimes take individually. If there is an injustice that seems deep enough and great enough, it will actually draw many of us in, and sometimes we may actually change the whole nation. So that's it. Thank you very much. I can actually just, for 1 minute, tell you about this. This was one of the things in doing the work I did that I learned a good deal about, and that is that sometimes, so those parents who don't have childcare and they work at nights, what some of them do, and in this case it was cleaners, they actually bring their children with them. So they're cleaning in buildings. The particular group that I followed for a little while cleans in buildings in downtown Boston. And they bring children and sleeping bags with them. And as they moved office to office, they moved their children with them. And the children would sleep, and then they'd move to another office. And that was underground parenting. As a little different take on take your children to work. It was remarkable to me how shared the perspectives were, even though one was a business, a big box store, in another case it was a hospital. These are very different sort of situations with different professionals in them. But it won't turn into something else unless these people know that they exist, that the other was, because one of the really common reactions I had when people would start to tell me these stories, would go into details about what they were doing, was they thought they were the only one who was doing it. And in some cases, they'd hooked up with another teacher, or the restaurant managers actually were sort of working in sync. So there were a few cases like that, but for the most part, people thought, it's me alone. I'm doing, and I have to stay quiet. So that silence has to, we have to elevate it to another place in order for it to be more than individual acts. Most of the people I talked to had not been caught. And I did interview a few people who had previously done this in a different setting and had either chosen to leave because they couldn't deal with the contradiction anymore or the stress. And then a couple of people who had been caught. Certainly, if you're caught falsifying records or giving groceries to somebody, unless the person above you, which did happen in this restaurant chain, the person above agreed. But generally, yeah, you're risking your job. These people are taking risks. Kim is taking a big risk. If she does something, she's taking a big risk. She's finishing college,
and she's in student services. If she does this, whatever it is, it's a big risk. So I think that, yeah, in some cases people really knew how to cover their tracks. I was amazed at the complexity of some ways people were doing this. The first thing that I say is always, I try to really affirm the moral complexity, because, you know, we don't talk about this kind of thing much. You know, we may loathe inequality and poverty, but the idea that there are moments when we might face, that we could actually make a gesture like that, and is it the right thing to do? It is very morally complex. It's just not, so that's really which is where she was at. I also told her not to talk to anybody else about it until she'd figured out what she was going to do, and actually did not ask her to tell me in the end what she decided to do. I'm actually extremely careful about information. I've been given some information that I haven't used in my book. I would say half of what I knew I did not put in the book, because even if it's easy to hide an individual, but sometimes you actually expose a process that people are using. And I think that what Kim was doing probably could be done in a lot of different colleges, if she does it. Well, I mean, the first thing I more than anything else is, you know, and this may be true of everyone in this room already, it's not true of most college students, however, is affirming that this is real, you know, that this is happening, that you see it, that we're taught to look at business decisions about, you know, cutting jobs, cutting costs, again, as amoral decisions, as though there's no humanity involved. And so the first thing I really encourage you is to let yourself see these issues, the truth of them. And then in terms of people's, you know, personal decisions, it's really hard to navigate your way in a society in which inequality is as great as this. And a lot of times you will make decisions which you know, in order to do the things you need to do. And I think that blaming yourself, I don't think this is so much about blaming yourself, which I think often comes up. I have students who come to me and talk with me about what they're doing next and feel a whole lot of guilt. They also have a whole lot of debt that they have to contend with. That's real. I mean, those are real things. But ultimately, I suppose my advice is to get involved where there is opportunity to get involved beyond just yourself, to work with people. Some students I know are now doing some work in an organization that's supporting raising the minimum wage. And they are getting and you know, they're writing papers about it. They're also getting a lot out of it personally. Another group of students I know are working with access to a certain health care that's been denied people in that state. So they're involved with what are sometimes local, but they're also a part of this larger picture. A lot of people got in touch with me because they wanted to tell me what they were doing. Sometimes a little bit too publicly, like I did a lot of radio shows, and you know, people really, I'm always very cautious about people being public when they're engaged in any of this. But I also got, so I did some of these shows, and I got a lot of pushback for sure. I did the show Market Money, you know, the NPR show. I did a few shows like that where there was, they got a lot of pushback. A call was made to the president of my university that I shouldn't be teaching students because I was, you know, pushing lawlessness, you know, reporting on what people were doing. So, you know, that sort of thing for sure. But actually more, I mean, that I'm aware of, more I got people saying that this is a dilemma they're struggling with, and they're trying to figure out where they are in this landscape. And they don't, I think probably one of the things that comes up a lot is, particularly with young people, they don't see a movement readily available, and there's the Occupy, and I think at one point, because I did this, you know, this came out just with the Occupy and movement, and that seemed, some people felt like that was, you know, sort of a glimmer, and I think it is. I think that that's right. But there aren't a lot of movements readily available, and I think that that's mostly what people talk about. You know, it depends on who the people are and how they're connected. Like, so some people who work in neighborhood health centers, or I think particularly I found public health sometimes in education, they might be likely, they might have in their lives studied, sort of looked at the framework of inequality and how, you know, so they might have language more readily available to talk about that. We don't give people a lot of language. We don't teach inequality, you know. We don't ever raise the notion that business might have culpability, might have some responsibility for what happens. So, you know, I found particularly people in business had a hard time. It was very personal. It was very much about, I know this is a good guy. This shouldn't happen to him, you know. I'm going to do this thing because I can't go along with it. But there was less likely to have a vision. You know, I mean, until people talk to one another and decide what the vision should be, which ultimately was the whole point of writing the book, was try to say, look, there's a lot of people out there, and we're stumbling in one way and we're trying something else, but there's actually a lot of people out there, which the polls, the surveys also suggest, who think this is not how they want their country to be going. It's not an individual battle. I think individuals are very concerned, but I think it has to be a movement, and it has to be much bigger than individuals. And, you know, I think the living wage, not just raising the minimum wage, but a living wage discussion is a really powerful one. It took a long, long time to get child labor laws, and what businesses all across this country, in the mines, the mills, I mean, there was a lot of child labor. What they said is that we will not be competitive anymore. We will not be able to we will stop being able, we'll close our factories if you take the kids out of them because we can pay them less. You know, there's always a business case to be made for not providing your people with a living wage. It turns out, you know, other countries actually provide workers, and they're doing, you know, they're in fact surviving, if not thriving, their economies who pay their workers a much closer to what we'd call the mean or median income than we do in this country. And we actually, you know, that there was a period in our history where if you know, the value of working a minimum wage was much closer to a survivable wage. So even in our country, we have a history. Well, so you're saying, do we have responsibility for the impact? Absolutely. You know, I mean, even more than what we choose to do in this country in terms of our wages, our trade agreements, I mean, you know, in fact, had a tremendous effect on that. But, you know, I don't think that we should back away from fighting for and arguing for a living wage for the people in this country because of those. I think that we have to see that they're connected. You know, they're mutual. I mean, there have been some efforts, which this is not my area of expertise, but I know there have been some efforts to actually link raising the wage here with raising the wage in some of the other places that American companies go, rather than seeing them as competing with each other. Yeah, which I think is a wonderful way to do it. Just to respond to your point about how unions might react, I got some very sharp criticisms in doing talks with union, and it wasn't that they thought it would undercut them, because the truth is there is not enough of this yet so that it can be felt in those terms. There just is not, unfortunately. But what they said is that they didn't want me putting this out in a way that didn't recognize that if a boss may choose to do favors for a worker, it actually could put that person in more disadvantaged position because you would owe somebody. And they said that's where the union comes in. You don't get this right because someone's doing you a favor. You get this right because it's your right, you know. So that's a critique that I've heard about this as well. Well, I see this as absolutely linked to ways in which people come together to support the idea that people who work in this country should not have to leave their children out on the playground, you know, while they're at their jobs, because they have no choice. So, and I think that's the real message to me, is who people are really across a spectrum in terms of class and identity, religion, areas of the country, that there was a real shared spirit here. And the unions, I think back that.
Really interesting.
In my opinion, what this really, you know, I mean, and every situation was different, and I just threw a few out to you. I think what was most important about this, there are many flaws, in this. If you look at it, it's not a movement, you know. There are many flaws in this. But the most important thing about it to me was that I think that we've come to accept the idea that our people are selfish, that, you know, I hear this a lot, particularly among students that I teach. They think they're not. But they think most of the other students are selfish. They think that, you know, that it's a bottom, you know, everything's a bottom line, and that business really is just impenetrable, that it is absolutely going to dominate. And so what I wanted to do is really show how many people you can run into all over who are very different, who actually take risks. I mean, that was the thing that was unexpected to me, was that people actually took risks for other people. And to me, that's the important, you know. And I don't think the union feels undercut by that. I think the union would like to see more sort of solidarity between people. Are we telling people that because we've structured a wage system that at this point you can work full-time and do the jobs of the nation and do them in all the ways we want you to do them, but you should not have the right to ever have a child, not because you're not working, or because you're not engaged in the society, or because you won't be responsible in all the ways you can, but because we don't provide childcare in America, which lots of other countries do, and that we've allowed the lower wages, the minimum wage, to drop so low. So in other words, we're shifting the damages, the impact of the way the economic structure, the way the wage system in this country, where it has gone, we're shifting the responsibility for that on low-income people and saying, on top of the fact that you're not going to be able to pay for college, you probably want to buy a house, we're saying you should never have children either. So we have a real, it's a really knee-jerk reaction in America to blame particularly poor women for poverty. And it really comes from, a lot of it comes from the way welfare was always framed, that people were irresponsible to have children. We sort of let that same I have my arguments with that to begin with, but we allowed that stereotype to actually accompany people into the workplace. We still blame them even if they're working full-time. Emily works 2 jobs, you know? So I think we have to really speak back to that. I mean, and also, a lot of people, when they have a child, they may have a career path. Edward had a career path. He was going to make sure his family was not going to pay back those. He also happened to, he's engaged, you know, but that is all going to be, could be pulled out from under him. So this issue of personal responsibility as opposed to kind of collective or, you know, economic responsibility of the nation, those two often get switched, yeah. You know, we almost always, people like me almost always point to, you know, the Nordic, we point to Sweden and we point to Norway and Denmark. You actually, on some of these issues, you can point to almost any, I mean, on an issue, for instance, paid leave, if you look at countries throughout the entire world, not only developed countries, but undeveloped countries, we are, at this point, I guess there's Swahililand and the U.S. are the 2 countries that have that provide absolutely no paid leave for when you have a baby, no maternity leave at all. I mean, we are outliers. We are real outliers. There's a wonderful set of slides. You have to critique them a little bit in terms of where they got the data, but overall, there's a wonderful set of slides that you can download for they're free. They're called the Spirit Level. And it's by 2, one's a demographer and the other, I'm not sure, maybe they're both demographers, but they actually look at the U.S. in comparison to about 25 other countries around the world. They look at issues of inequality. And we really are an outlier in terms of, not only in terms of wages, but in terms of what we make, what we provide for families. There are lots of countries around the world make sure that if a mom and dad are working or a single mom is working, that her child is safe. There are different kinds of childcare options. Some of them are better than others, but we have 0. Basically, the way your child will be safe is if you have enough money to buy market-level childcare. There's 15% of children in this country, that it averages about 15% of children who are eligible based on income have access to publicly funded childcare. About 85% do not, because we just don't have it. We don't fund it. So other countries you could go. I would point to the European countries, European Union countries, but there are actually a lot of countries around the world that have much less wealthy than the U.S. who invest more in children, particularly in children. Yeah. I've been working, so I've always been sort of a public sociologist. I've always been sort of inside, outside, and I'm involved with a lot of different organizations. I was over many, many years, and that provided me with doors to get through it in lots of different kinds of settings. The toughest was business. The toughest was getting into different big box stores to talk to managers. But I would use the contacts I had, sometimes through healthcare. I would end up, people would know people who worked in different kinds of companies. I basically would just go in and say, I know you work with low-wage workers, I want to hear from your perspective. I've talked to a lot of them. I want to hear from your perspective how this is for you. What do you see? How does it work? And interestingly enough, a lot of people, including people who said it's all their fault, they shouldn't have had kids. It's one person who went on and on about this woman he hired who had a newborn baby, and she was so irresponsible not to tell him because of course she was going to have problems. So I got the other side too, very much so. But interestingly, once people sit down and start talking, they're running into a lot of issues, particularly those who have some moral concerns. They're running into a lot of issues, and they seldom get to talk about them. So it's the initial getting in the door was not that easy. And then, when you get in one place, you go to another. People hear that you're not using their names. They get to censor some things. That's something I often do with people, particularly if they're telling me ways that they're breaking the law. I tell them when I'm done. Often I can't find people again, and particularly if I'm in a different city. But when I'm done, I say, do you want to take a look at this and decide? And usually, no one was ever concerned that their name was going to be. But the thing I mentioned before was really the biggest issue. I got some stories about how some people are diverting money to take care of people that were just really wonderful stories. If I'd reported on them, the ways they do it would have been exposed. So we would agree together just not to do that. But it took me 8 years. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.